Hello friends, today's lecture in the series is by Professor Payal Nagpal, who teaches English in Janaki Devi Memorial College, Delhi University. And as you all know, we've been working on a series as for presentation, and that series is connected with the modern Indian English writing. The specific word that is there in the title is Indian English writing. So Indians who started writing in English, and we are in the beginning of the series, and therefore we pick up things and writers from the 19th century to begin with, and later on we will come to the 20th century also. So the author selected for discussion today is Toru Dutt, a person who was educated in a very unusual way in India in the 19th century, and a woman writer at that. So a woman writer and one who is one of the pioneers of Indian English in our writing. So who could be a better speaker to speak on this particular area, because this is both 19th century and it's about a woman. So over to you, Professor Payal Nagpal, and please begin.
Thank you, Professor Prakash. So, as you rightly pointed out, that this is a 19th century writer and a woman at that. So, today I think when we use a lot of theories, and especially when we use feminist theory, we use the word agency quite a bit, and say that there are writers who kind of gave agency. So, if we talk about this particular word, I think Toru Dutt is truly the pioneer in this, pioneer in writing. Here is a portrait of Toru Dutt from 1856. So, certainly a pioneer in writing, and very, very interesting, because we are talking about the beginnings here, about writing in English, about Indians writing in English, a language that was not specifically, it's not a language that belonged to them, but it's a language that came to them through the colonizers. So, Toru Dutt was born in Calcutta in 1856, and she was, her father was known to be, very, very, he was a well-known figure because he worked as a magistrate in Calcutta. This also meant that the family had connections, in a sense, with the English people. And then there was her mother, Kshetramoni Dutt, who belonged to the Rambagan Dutt family, and they converted to Christianity in 1862.
And this community that was there, so she had this advantage of being born in a family that was connected with bureaucracy.
Certainly in terms of education particularly, because here we see that it's also a family that has converted to Christianity. And as a result, the family was also ostracized. And that has pretty much mentioned this in the letter.
The usual way of getting education is not there in the 19th century.
Absolutely. So, as we can note that, the family had to face a lot of flack. They were practically ostracized, and this is also something that's, kind of mentioned by Toru Dutt in her letters. So, it was, she had two siblings. So, one was a brother, Abju, and then there was Aro. Abju, however, of course, died early. And Toru Dutt herself, she died at a very, very young age of 21. So, she dies in 1877. The interesting, why it's important to look into her life and talk a little bit about that is because her education has a very interesting trajectory. So, the family traveled. They moved to, they moved to Nice, they moved to Italy briefly, from there to London and then Cambridge. So, this trajectory gave her not only education of a certain kind, but it also gave Toru Dutt an exposure of a very different kind. See, the context being that when we read a lot of her letters, when we read her poetry, today primarily we will be discussing Toru Dutt's poetry. So, we note the use of certain tropes from nature, similes and metaphors that emerge from a very, very English, from a very European context. So, that is possible not just through imagination, but the very real exposure that Toru Dutt had. So, her father, gave a very interesting description of Toru Dutt saying that she was, to quote, she was puny and elf-like with dishevelled tresses, self-willed and shy, never heeding that I call, intent to pay her tenderest addresses to bird or cat, but most intelligent. So, from the very beginning, it was quite obvious that she had a very, very inquisitive mind and was quick to observe and absorb things. While she was in Nice, she learned French, and later, with her father, from her father, she wanted to learn Sanskrit. So, one can see this very, very, kind of wide exposure that she had, which is, of course, reflected in her writings. The first being A Sheaf Gleaned from French Fields. So, she translated a lot of the French writers into English. And then there is the Ancient Ballads and Legends of Hindustan. So here is a writer, we can just make out from these two titles. One, what is gleaned from the French fields, and then there are the ballads and legends of Hindustan. What this essentially means is that we are looking at a writer whose writing is a kind of coming together of very, very different traditions. So, for example, if you look at her poetry, so she's talking about the flora and fauna in India, the flora and fauna that's abroad, and then she has a ballad on Lakshmana. So, here is a writer who's writing, if you look at it, you'd probably think this is somebody, if one doesn't know that this is Toru Dutt's writing, one would squarely place it within the English tradition. And yet, there is also a ballad on Lakshman. So, this is also a writer who's kind of experimenting. So she has an unfinished novel to her credit, and she, of course, also wrote the Journal of Mademoiselle d'Avers. And her Sheaf Gleaned in French Fields, it had translations of 165 poems, and 8 of these were translated by her sister Aru. So this meant that there were roughly about 70 French poets. So, and at the same time, her own original poetry, plus a journal of, as mentioned, of Mademoiselle d'Avers, published in 1879. And Ancient Ballads and Legends of Hindustan, which is her poetry collection, also has a specific section called the Miscellaneous Poems, where there are personal verses, and one of the poems that we will be discussing today is the Casuarina Tree, which has been, it has received wide acclaim. It's considered, in a sense, very, very representative of Toru Dutt's writing. And Edmund Goss, who'd written, the introduction to her book, says that this poem is one of the most remarkable poems ever written in English by a foreigner. So, at the same time, one has James Darmesteter, who, kind of pays her a tribute by saying, and I quote, that the daughter of Bengal, so admirable and so strangely gifted, Hindu by race and tradition, and an English woman by education, a French woman at heart, a poet in English, prose writer in French, who at the age of 18 made India acquainted with the poets of French herself, who blended in herself 3 souls and 3 traditions. So I think this quote really kind of brings together the different traditions, that conventions, and at the same time the very, very active, fertile and creative mind that is blending these conventions to come up with something that is truly original. That's not simply borrowed convention, but she's also kind of tinkering with it to see how it is working in the Indian context. And of course, it is a very, very young mind, and to do so much so early is really remarkable. I'd request Professor Prakash to share his views on this.
Oh, no, definitely. I can't imagine anyone, who is at the age of 16 or 17, in being interested in the flora and fauna, as you say, the trees and the birds in India, and the different languages in Europe. And she traverses this kind of a thing so well in all the writing, and at the age of 21 she'll say goodbye to the world. So that kind of a writer who has such diversity of interests and such a sensitive mind that she is curious only about the aspect of culture, the aspect of knowledge, aspect of traditions, conventions, etc. This can't be easily imagined, particularly in India.
In India.
Romantic poets, some of them, the Keats, for instance, would also die very early in life, but then he would focus it on, only through one language. And here she has kind of familiarity with 3 or 4 languages, and Sanskrit she wants to read. Imagine that. So it really, one is wonderstruck by the kind of genius that she was and what she might have become if she lived on.
Lived on, yes, certainly. I mean, really, what she might have become if she had lived on. Because already it's like, if one looks at Indian English writing, and in a sense, it's like pre-Indian English writing in that sense. So it's like, the canon would begin from her. So certainly. And the 19th century in the context of India was also very interesting. I mean, at the national level, of course, the revolt of 1857, the mutiny had already taken place, and globally we had the Franco-Prussian War, the Crimean War. So India continued to be a colony, and all these factors, and in the midst of all of this, to have a writer like this was certainly very, very inspiring. So because of exposure to these different worlds that are reflected in her writings, in her poetry, so one can see, especially in the letters that she had written to her friend Mary Martin, about how there was a yearning for England, and to begin with, a kind of rejection of her native space, that was Calcutta. Because there's probably a desire, in a sense, to kind of convert Calcutta and to look at it as some kind of a space that England was. So, for example, she detested the climate, and she wanted it to be a place and that was more akin to England, and she related in that sense more to England than she did to the Indian context in that sense. So now, if we actually look at, she herself was, of course, very, very well read. So her letters tell us, a lot about how she's familiar with Charles Dickens and George Sand, Victor Hugo. She was also familiar with Balzac, Zola, had heard of Flaubert, had read through Carlyle, and series one can see. So she looks at the Hooghly and bridge, and she compares it to the Suez Canal. So that's the kind of frame of mind that we are really looking at. So if we look at the poem that we're going to discuss today, A Casuarina Tree. So here are a few lines from the poem. Up to its very summit, near the stars, a creeper climbs, in whose embraces bound no other tree could live. But gallantly the giant wears the scarf, and flowers are hung in crimson clusters all the boughs among, whereon all day are gathered burden be. If we just look at these, the first lines in the Casuarina Tree, so one can see that, this would pretty much read like a poem written by any of the Romantic poets. And of course, critics have also said that, probably it's because Toru Dutt is writing in India that, she receives the kind of attention that she does, because maybe it could have been lost in the canon of English Romantic poetry, so to say. So if you look at, the images that are here, the use of the stars, the creeper, and then the scarf, the flowers, crimson clusters. So all these images create in our mind, a kind of natural, landscape that is that belongs not so much, to 19th century India than it probably does to England. So I'd request Professor Prakash also to respond.
I was thinking when you were reading out a few lines from this poem, I was wondering whether a Casuarina Tree also has some familiarity with India, where it appears to be an English or a European tree, and she is interested in this tree, which means she is carrying the tradition of Indian, culture and nature. India has been a great land of nature in the 19th century and before, and you have poets, Sanskrit poets, talking about nature then, and she has imbibed all that as a sense of closeness to nature, and she's finding it wherever she goes.
Yes.
And she is able to imagine things which are difficult to get for a youngster and the person who has come from India, and yet she is able to talk so very closely in such familiar terms about a tree, about its about the birds, or the sky, the stars, and all those things, and the interests are purer. The interests
Yes.
are very sensitive, and she is able to she seems to be lost in the scene, and yet she holds her ground by interpreting the nature as it occurs to her.
As it occurs to her. True. And in fact, when we also analyze other poems by her, so there is this there's a contradictory yearning. On the one hand, Toru Dutt, continues to relate to the English climes and nature over there, and yet at the same time, there is a very strong yearning also for what is at home back in India. So both these, contradictory strands continue in her poetry, as we can see in the Casuarina tree. So to continue this poem further, and oft at nights the garden overflows with one sweet song that seems to have no close, sung darkling from our tree while men repose, when first my casement is wide open thrown. So again, oft at nights, if you look at this kind of phraseology, it's very, very English. And the garden overflows. Again, this sense is, pretty much of the English landscape. And there is, one must note in reading it out also, that there is a very, very nice lyrical quality that is there to this particular poem. So, at dawn, she writes, my eyes delighted on it rest, sometimes and most in winter on its crest. And now she brings in a baboon. So, a grey baboon sits statue-like alone, watching the sunrise, while on lower boughs his puny offspring leap about and play, and far and near, and please note now the kokilas are here, and far and near, kokilas hail the day, and to their pastures wend our sleepy cows, and in the shadow on the broad tank cast by that hoar tree, so beautiful and vast, the water lilies like snow enmassed. So, the very fact that, she is from, West Bengal, but the whole idea of snow enmassed, and, then there is the baboon, and there are the kokilas, and, there's a hoar tree, there are water lilies. So, one thing is very, very clear, that she is, if we may call it in that sense, a romantic poet. And she brings that tradition of writing, poetry, writing romantic poetry to India. So, on the one hand, there is language, and on the other hand, there is also nature, and there is the understanding of, the way in which the English writers, both the men and the women, the way they would look at the English landscape. So, all these factors come in together in a poem like a Casuarina tree, and there is a very strong trope of memory too in this particular poem.
So, for instance, there is a gap of 50-60 years between the composition of this poem and the romantic poems that were published before. Romanticism in England would emerge in the late 19th century and will continue till 1930s or 1830s or so, and she is not born then, but in the 70s when she composes this poem, then she has gone through all this romantic poetry.
Yes.
And see the vocabulary, it is very Keatsian.
It's very Keatsian.
Because she is taking pleasure in talking about trees and about birds and about leaves and about flowers, and looking as sensitively regarding these things is remarkable for a person who is writing just 50 years after Romanticism. So she has absorbed everything that is there in the romantic poets of the time.
Absolutely, and she's totally absorbed it, and she's also kind of bringing together the two traditions or styles, one would say, actually not really traditions, but we have the romantic style, and then at the same time she's also in a sense for want of any other word, applying it in a sense to the Indian context and experimenting. So, the images are from both sides, and
Very
which
fine
is why
fusion.
very fine fusion,
Yes, yes.
very fine fusion. And so that kind of also brings us to understand the way in which Indian English writing in a sense begins, almost like the Anglo-Indian writing, to if one were to use that term. So it begins with that whole concept of the romantic tradition in writing. And
So suppose I ask you a question from you, Professor Payal Nagpal. In the 19th century, it would be sacrilegious to talk about nature, which is the land of poverty and all those things. And yet, Romanticism left such a fine impact on Indians' imagination. So completely away from tradition, and somebody is writing about these modern images of taking pleasure in nature. So, and Romanticism was very critical about capitalism, about industry, about the cities coming up and polluting the entire atmosphere, and India would be a home for freshness of nature. So she is able to just pick up these things from English, this English literature, and she makes them Indian in her own way.
So actually, absolutely, because I think what Toru Dutt is also doing somewhere is like what you rightly said, that at that point of time, it was the country was not developed in that sense that let's say England would be, and though of course the Romantic poets were against industrialization and the complete devastation in a sense of the English landscape because of that. So the poets kept going back to nature for that reason. So in Toru Dutt, there is also, however, a yearning for somewhere the Indian countryside to look like the English, to be more developed there. So, which is why I think she constantly keeps bringing images from both countries together in her writing. And I think the whole idea of conversion also to Christianity, something that the family also in a sense embraced the English tradition, even though at the same time they were all very, very aware, and Toru Dutt herself has written about this in her letters, about the way in which there were kind of layers of difference that were there despite the conversion, about the way the Bengalis who would have converted to Christianity were treated. So she's acutely conscious of this also in her letters. So,
and Romanticism in general in the 19th century would attract the attention of the young. You have very, very soon other poets, Sarojini Naidu for instance,
yes,
in the latter half of the century, and later, much later. So these people would pick up Romanticism as an example of good writing.
Good writing.
That's where the tradition of Indian English writing is concerned. It comes from. And friends, in the first part of the discussion, Professor Nagpal has talked about the 19th century creativity through the example of Toru Dutt, and let's see how this example further evolves into a kind of pattern, into a kind of ideology, as a kind of thought through her writings and through her this intellectual social behavior. So let's wait for a few minutes and then we resume the discussion regarding other aspects of Toru Dutt writing and as an example of Indian English writing in general.